The story you're about to hear does not come from the front pages of history textbooks. It is not the kind of tale nations like to remember, but it happened in the shadows of World War I, in the mountains and plains where the Assyrians had lived for millennia. Their churches, their villages, their language, their people, all became targets in a campaign of extermination that to this day remains obscured beneath more publicized atrocities. This is the story of the Assyrian Genocide, or what many Assyrians call Sepho, the year of the sword. This genocide, which occurred primarily between 1914 and 1920, claimed the lives of approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Assyrian men, women, and children. It was part of a broader campaign by the Ottoman Empire that also included the Armenian and Greek genocides. But the Assyrian story has long gone underreported, underrecognized, and, for many, completely forgotten. Yet the Assyrians were not a nameless people. They were the descendants of one of the oldest civilizations in human history. The builders of Nineveh, the scribes of Akkadian, the first to create a library, the first to organize an empire. By the dawn of the 20th century, their numbers had dwindled, but their cultural legacy remained fierce, rooted in ancient Christian identity, in villages scattered across what is now southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, northwestern Iran, and northeastern Syria. This is not just a story of death. It is a story of memory, a story of survival, a story that begins not in blood, but in silence. To understand the genocide, we must understand the people who endured it. The Assyrians are a Semitic people, indigenous to Mesopotamia, with a lineage that traces back over 4,000 years. Long before Rome, before Islam, before the modern Turkish or Arab states, the Assyrians built a civilization on the banks of the Tigris River that defined early empire, ruthless in conquest, brilliant in architecture, and foundational to law and writing. By the time the Ottomans took control of the region in the 16th century, the Assyrians had long been Christian, adherents of churches like the Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, and the Syriac Orthodox Church. They lived in tribal structures, mostly rural, mountainous, and self-governing, with strong bishops and tribal leaders. They were a religious minority in a Sunni Muslim empire. They were tolerated, taxed, sometimes protected, and often blamed, particularly when tensions flared between Muslims and Christians across the region. By the 19th century, European missionaries and powers took a strong interest in the fate of the Assyrians, sometimes arming or encouraging them, and sometimes abandoning them when protection was most needed. As the Ottoman Empire began to crumble in the early 20th century, suspicion toward Christian minorities increased. Nationalist fervor swept through the Young Turks, and in their eyes, the Assyrians, like the Armenians and Greeks, were viewed not just as outsiders, but as internal enemies. World War I. The war gave cover for the unspeakable. Ottoman authorities accused the Assyrians of colluding with the Russians and the British, and these accusations, whether true or not, were used to justify systematic removal and annihilation. The empire had made a decision. This was to be the year of the sword. In Hakkari, where the patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East, Mar Shimun Nyantianti Benjamin, held sway, the mountains became a battleground. In March 1915, after attempts at negotiation, Mar Shimun was assassinated by Kurdish leader Simko Shikak. What followed was a nightmare. Ottoman soldiers and Kurdish irregulars attacked Assyrian villages one by one. Entire families were slaughtered. Children were flung from cliffs. Churches were torched. Men were tied to trees and flayed alive. One survivor, who would later speak to Western missionaries, described the massacre of the village of Gawar. They came before dawn. They called for us to come out peacefully, but when we did, they opened fire. My mother was carrying my brother. They shot her first. Then they dragged the priest from the chapel and cut his throat in front of us. This was not war. This was extermination. As the killing spread across Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, the methods became more organized. In villages like Azak, Midyat, and Nisibis, Ottoman authorities issued orders. Assyrian men were rounded up and killed first to prevent resistance. Women and children were marched into the hills, raped, starved, and often executed en masse. In Tur Abdin, monks from the 1,500-year-old monastery of Mor Gabriel tried to offer sanctuary. They could not hold off the attacks forever. Some were burned alive in the chapel. Others managed to resist, using ancient stone walls and narrow mountain passes to fight off the soldiers for weeks. But eventually, even these strongholds fell. In Urmia, in what is now Iran, thousands of Assyrian refugees fled to the protection of Russian forces. But when Russia withdrew in 1917, the Assyrians were left exposed. The Persian governor's forces and local militias turned on them. In one 3-day massacre, nearly 10,000 Assyrians were killed. Everywhere the pattern repeated: rumors, arrests, disarmament, massacres, displacement, pillage, conversion by force, and silence. Because the world was too busy watching Europe to look eastward. The Armenians received some attention in Western papers. The Assyrians did not. Their deaths occurred in remote villages, far from cameras, far from embassies, and far from the powers that might have saved them. By 1918, as the war neared its end, the Assyrian population of the Ottoman Empire had been decimated. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Entire communities erased from the map. Thousands more fled to Iraq, Syria, the Caucasus, and eventually the United States, Australia, and Europe. The survivors carried only their memories and the pain of betrayal. Many had trusted Ottoman promises of protection. Others had been assured by local Kurdish allies that they would be safe. Those who lived saw their villages burned, their churches flattened, their cemeteries defiled. In Iraq, the British promised protection, but this too would end in disappointment. In 1933, just 15 years after the original genocide, thousands of Assyrians were again massacred in the town of Simele by the newly formed Iraqi army, in what many historians call the Second Sifo. To this day, the Assyrian Genocide remains unrecognized by most governments. Turkey denies it ever happened. Many history books fail to mention it at all. Survivors are dying. Their descendants are scattered. Their villages are ghost towns. But the stories remain. In whispered Syriac hymns sung by grandmothers in Chicago, in faded photos smuggled out of Mardin, in the ancient script carved into the stones of monasteries still standing against time. The world may forget, but the Assyrians remember. The empire was fracturing. It had been for decades. But in 1914, the cracks widened into canyons. The Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe, was bleeding, and the response from its leaders was not retreat, not reconciliation, not reform. It was a purge. This chapter peels back the veil on the political machinery that enabled genocide. It is a story of state-sanctioned paranoia, radicalization from the top, and the twisted arithmetic of imperial survival that would soon engulf the Assyrians. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a mighty colossus. It was a shadow of its former self, hemorrhaging territory, sovereignty, and confidence. The European powers circled like wolves, eager for scraps, and within the empire, voices of dissent grew louder. Arabs, Armenians, Kurds, Greeks, Assyrians, all chafed under Turkish rule. In 1908, the Young Turks staged a coup, a modernizing force, they claimed, backed by promises of constitutional reform and ethnic equality. But beneath their polished slogans was an undercurrent of ultranationalism. They didn't seek equality. They sought survival through Turkification. The Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, the brain trust of the Young Turk movement, quickly tightened its grip. By 1913, after a second coup, the triumvirate of Talat Pasha, Interior, Enver Pasha, War, and Cemal Pasha, Navy, effectively ruled as dictators. What began as reform became repression. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the Ottomans saw both danger and opportunity. Aligning with Germany, the empire hoped to claw back its relevance. But war demanded internal control. Loyalty was non-negotiable. The cup's logic became cold and brutal. Any ethnic group that could potentially side with the Russians, who were Orthodox, like the Armenians and Assyrians, had to be neutralized. This is where the genocide machinery began its calculations. Armenians were the largest Christian minority, and they were first. But Assyrians, spread across southeastern Anatolia, northern Mesopotamia, and western Persia, were not far behind. Many lived near volatile borders, and their ties to the West and their Christianity rendered them suspect in the eyes of the state. A critical moment came in early 1915. Assyrian leaders in Hakkari refused Ottoman demands to hand over weapons and pledge allegiance. This act of resistance, limited and local, was interpreted by the cup as rebellion. And rebellion, in wartime logic, meant extermination. Before the killing came the rhetoric. Ottoman authorities unleashed a wave of propaganda. Christians were framed as internal enemies, agents of Western imperialism, and threats to Islam. Imams, tribal leaders, and bureaucrats were enlisted to incite hatred. Fatwas were issued, declaring it a religious duty to oppose Christians. The language shifted. Assyrians were no longer neighbors. They were infidels, spies, traitors. This wasn't merely about war strategy. It was about cleansing. A chilling example came in 1915, when Ottoman governor Cevdet Bey ordered the execution of hundreds of Assyrian men in Salmas and Urmia. His stated justification: they were collaborating with Russia. But reports from missionaries and survivors tell a different story, one of preemptive extermination and terror campaigns aimed at removing Christian populations from contested frontiers. The genocide of the Assyrians wasn't just carried out by Ottoman soldiers. Kurdish tribal militias, often armed and encouraged by the government, played a gruesome role. In Tur Abdin, Mardin, Midyat, and Hakkari, Kurdish units attacked Assyrian villages with impunity. Entire towns were razed, men were slaughtered, women and children were enslaved or forcibly converted. Tribal leaders, seeking favor with the Ottomans, saw opportunity in Assyrian land and livestock. To be clear, not all Kurds participated. Some protected their Assyrian neighbors, but those who joined the bloodshed did so with the assurance of impunity. The Ottoman state created a vacuum of morality, then filled it with zealotry and greed. After the war, when questions were asked, "Why did you kill the Assyrians?" the Ottoman defense was always the same: internal security. The state insisted it was fighting rebellion, that the Assyrians had risen up. But even Ottoman military memos from 1915 contradict this. They show that most Assyrian regions were peaceful until attacked. The rebellion was often manufactured or provoked, used as a pretext to launch massacres. The empire had no room for nuance. In their calculus, Christian plus proximity to Russia equals enemy, and so began one of history's lesser-known genocides. European missionaries and diplomats in Persia and Anatolia documented the killings. Letters poured in, reports of churches burned, priests executed, women raped, villages emptied. But Europe was at war, and the Assyrians were stateless. There was no embassy to defend them, no crown to plead on their behalf. In Paris and London, the plight of the Armenians made headlines, barely, but the Assyrians, they remained a footnote. To the Ottoman state, this silence was permission. One figure stands out in Assyrian memory: Cevdet Bey, the Ottoman governor of the Van province and one of the principal architects of the genocide in the eastern regions. Cevdet's cruelty was methodical. He orchestrated mass killings in Gawir, Kudshanis, and Salmas. In April 1915, he reportedly declared, "I shall do to the Assyrians what Enver Pasha did to the Armenians in Van." Thousands were slaughtered in days. Entire dioceses of the Assyrian Church of the East were wiped out. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Priests were crucified. Children were burned alive in their churches. The horror was systematic and personal. Perhaps the greatest blow came with the fall of Hakkari, the mountainous heartland of the Assyrian people. For centuries, Hakkari was the seat of Assyrian autonomy, where tribal leaders ruled semi-independently and bishops held spiritual authority. In 1915, after waves of attacks by Ottoman and Kurdish forces, the Assyrians of Hakkari fled, over mountains, through blizzards, under fire. Thousands died in the exodus. Women carried infants across icy passes. Elders perished in the snow. Those who remained were annihilated. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, churches looted. Hakkari was emptied of its native people. The loss of Hakkari was not just a geographic defeat. It was cultural decapitation. As the Ottoman war machine ground forward, the Assyrian people faced a lethal trinity: government persecution, tribal betrayal, and global indifference. They were marked not by what they had done, but by who they were: Christian, indigenous, vulnerable. The empire had made its decision. The Assyrians were expendable. When empires fall, they do not do so quietly. They collapse with tremors that ripple across the lives of ordinary people. Borders dissolve, leaders vanish, and into the void pours chaos. For the Assyrians of the Ottoman Empire, the twilight of the Sultan's rule did not bring salvation. It brought fire. This is the story of how the fall of an empire became the breeding ground for genocide. It is the story of betrayal, fractured promises, and the weaponization of nationalism. It is the chapter where desperation gave birth to systematic extermination. As the 20th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire was a relic of its former self. Dubbed the sick man of Europe, it limped toward collapse, held together more by fear than faith. Internal divisions tore at its seams. The Balkan states had begun declaring independence. Armenians and Greeks demanded rights. And the Assyrians, a tiny Christian nation without a state, were caught in a tightening vice. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 promised reform. The Committee of Union and Progress, GLSIAP, which seized power, spoke of constitutionalism, of unity, of equality under the law. But their promises, like paper soaked in kerosene, quickly burned away. Behind closed doors, the Cup elite were already drawing new maps of a pure Turkish nation. One language, one faith, one people, and Assyrians were not included. In the words of Talayat Pasha, one of the architects of genocide, "The time has come to deal with the foreign elements once and for all." The outbreak of World War I in 1914 cracked the empire wide open. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers, aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The war, they believed, would be a chance to reassert dominance, to reforge the empire in fire. It also gave them a convenient excuse to target those they already viewed as threats. Assyrians, who had ancient ties to Western missionaries and distant alliances with Russian or British forces, were accused of sedition, of being spies, collaborators, infidels. Across the eastern provinces of Hakkari, Tur Abdin, and Van, whispers turned to orders. Villages were marked. Lists were drawn. In the snowy mountains, patriarchs gathered their communities, fearing what might come. Some pleaded for help from European diplomats. Others read from Bibles by candlelight and told their children to be brave. What they didn't know was that a plan had already been set in motion, a plan that would wipe their villages from the earth. In 1915, Ottoman troops and Kurdish tribal irregulars began coordinated assaults on Assyrian villages throughout the Hakkari Mountains. Entire communities, numbering in the thousands, were surrounded, disarmed, and slaughtered. The town of Gawar, once a thriving center of Assyrian Christian life, was razed in a single day. "They came at dawn," one survivor recounted decades later. "They told us to leave everything and come outside. Then they shot the men, took the women, and burned the rest." In a letter smuggled to an American missionary, an Assyrian priest wrote, "My people are no more. Our homes are smoke and ashes. Tell the world we died faithful." The Assyrian patriarch Mar Shmun Benjamin attempted to negotiate with the Ottomans. His words were met with silence, then betrayal. In March 1918, he was assassinated by a Kurdish chieftain under Ottoman protection during peace negotiations. His death was symbolic, a decapitation of a people. Much like their Armenian neighbors, Assyrians were subjected to mass deportations. Men were separated and executed. Women and children were marched into deserts, starved, or sold into slavery. In southeastern Anatolia, entire districts were emptied of Assyrians within months. One German officer, witnessing the aftermath, wrote in his journal, "The land is dotted with corpses. The rivers are red. These people did not die in war. They were destroyed deliberately." In the Urmia and Salmas plains of Persia, modern-day Iran, Ottoman incursions reached Assyrian refugee camps. Tens of thousands fled, only to be struck down by disease, hunger, and exposure. The retreat became known as the Death March of 1918. An American nurse working in the region wrote, "We could do nothing. They came in waves, gaunt, silent, many barefoot, some carrying dying babies. The Turks chased them even across the borders. In the mountainous monasteries of Tur Abdin, Assyrians made their final stand. Armed with hunting rifles and spiritual resolve, small bands of men defended ancient churches from Ottoman battalions. The siege of the village of Ain Wardo, present-day Gulgoz, lasted nearly 2 months. An Assyrian fighter, later interviewed by British officers, said, "We buried our dead at night. We fought with ghosts behind us, our ancestors, our saints. We had no hope, but we had no choice. The resistance slowed the Ottoman advance, but could not stop the inevitable. One by one, villages fell. The great monasteries of Mor Gabriel and Mor Hananyo, standing since the 5th century, were desecrated. Priests were executed before their altars." By the time World War I ended in 1918, it's estimated that between 250,000 to 300,000 Assyrians, more than half the population, had perished. Countless others were scattered, orphaned, forced to convert, or absorbed into Kurdish or Turkish households under false identities. Their churches were turned to rubble. Their language, a dialect of ancient Aramaic, was silenced in many towns. The Ottoman Empire itself collapsed shortly after the war. But no justice came for the Assyrians. No Nuremberg, no tribunals. They were not even named. While the Armenian Genocide began to gain international recognition, the Assyrian tragedy was folded into footnotes, referenced as collateral. But the Assyrians remembered, in exile, in refugee camps, in whispered prayers. This ends not with a single battle, but with the slow erasure of a nation from its homeland. This was not just a genocide. It was an annihilation of history, a deliberate unmaking of an ancient people's presence in the very cradle of civilization. And yet, the Assyrian people survived, not because anyone saved them, but because survival was the only answer to attempted extinction. They carried their faith across borders. They sang their prayers in foreign tongues. And they remembered. For memory is the only weapon left when the world turns away. The year was 1915. The roads were choked with ice and bodies, and the snow ran red in the hills of Hakkari. But this was not the end. It was merely the migration of death. The Assyrian Genocide did not remain confined to a single province. It ignited like brush fire across the Christian highlands, fanned by Ottoman orders, Kurdish opportunism, and the silence of a world at war. This chapter takes us into the blood-soaked interior of the Ottoman Empire, from the crumbling churches of Tur Abdin to the death marches through Mosul's scorching deserts. The story of the Assyrian people was being rewritten in fire. Tur Abdin, the mountain of the servants of God, had been a spiritual capital for the Assyrians since antiquity. Monasteries like Mor Gabriel and Mor Hananyo rose like stone ships from the hills, ancient and stoic. But in 1915, the soldiers came. Villages such as Azak, Midyat, and Iwardo were surrounded. Assyrian villagers, many of them farmers and priests, formed resistance units armed with hunting rifles, pitchforks, and desperation. They fortified themselves in their churches, turning monasteries into fortresses. Some held out for months. In Azak, a brutal siege unfolded. Over 1,000 Assyrians repelled a coordinated assault by Turkish gendarmes and Kurdish irregulars. When Ottoman artillery arrived, it was only a matter of time. Entire families were burned alive in cellars or shot in courtyards. The surviving defenders, starving and wounded, were forced to flee or face execution. But even in retreat, they carried with them something indestructible: liturgy, language, legacy. Further south, the Tigris River became a route of slaughter. Ottoman authorities rounded up Assyrian leaders under false pretenses. In Jazira, 200 elders were summoned for a council and executed by firing squad within hours. Their bodies were dumped into the river, washed clean by the current, erased from the record. In the villages of the Kabur Basin, women were marched naked through the streets before being sold into slavery or killed outright. Children were torn from their mothers and handed to Kurdish tribes to be raised Muslim. In Diyarbakir, the governor, Rashid Bey, already notorious for orchestrating the Armenian massacres, turned his attention to the Assyrian quarter. Eyewitnesses reported bodies piled in the alleys, desecrated churches, and blood on the altar cloths. Across the Persian border, the Assyrians of Urmia had long lived under relative safety. But when the Russians, who had offered a fragile protection, suddenly withdrew, a vacuum opened. Turkish and Kurdish forces descended. The massacre that followed was swift and systematic. In January 1915, Urmia burned. Dr. William Shedd, an American missionary, described the carnage in a letter. "I saw bodies stacked 6 high, as if they had been logs. Whole families, men, women, children, shot where they stood or knifed in their beds. Over 200 villages in the Urmia plain were emptied. Survivors fled toward Hamadan, forming a hellish column of refugees stretching over 60 miles. Thousands died from exposure, starvation, and raids along the road. In the oil-rich province of Mosul, a different horror unfolded, not one of direct slaughter, but of systematic erasure. Ottoman authorities conducted mass arrests of priests, bishops, and scholars. Manuscripts were burned, schools were shuttered. Assyrian property was confiscated and redistributed to Arab and Kurdish families. While the massacres raged elsewhere, in Mosul the genocide took the shape of cultural extermination. The people were still breathing, but their past was being torn from their hands. One priest, Father Elias of Tel Kepe, wrote in a secret diary, "They do not kill us with the sword, but with silence. They murder the memory." In the city of Mardin, Assyrian children were rounded up into schools by the Ottoman administration. These were not institutions of learning. They were processing centers for forced conversion. Children were given Turkish names, forbidden to speak Syriac. Girls as young as 9 were married off to Turkish officers. Boys were taken to military academies where they were beaten until they forgot the names of their fathers. A few managed to escape, thin, barefoot, half mad. They told of mass graves behind schoolhouses and priests buried alive in front of the students as a warning. Despite Ottoman attempts to suppress foreign reporting, some missionaries bore witness. Dr. Grace Knapp, stationed in Harput, documented scenes of death marches where babies froze to their mothers' corpses. She called it a slow crucifixion of an entire people. In Mosul, a German officer named Max Erwin von Scheubner Richter wrote in a secret dispatch, The same techniques employed against the Armenians are now used against the Assyrians. It is methodical, it is planned, and it is monstrous. Yet these warnings went largely ignored. The world was preoccupied with trench warfare and shifting alliances. The screams of Assyrians were drowned out by the roar of cannons in France. The final horror of this chapter comes not from guns, but from the sun. Survivors from Hakkari, Urmia, and Tur Abdin, tens of thousands, were forced into mass marches through the deserts of northern Iraq and Syria, without water, without food, under guard by soldiers who delighted in cruelty. Mothers carried dead infants for miles, unwilling to abandon them. Elderly priests collapsed mid-prayer. Bodies were left unburied, picked apart by vultures. Some camps became mass graves. Others became open-air prisons. By the time they reached Aleppo or Derzor, only a fraction still breathed. The Assyrian Genocide was not an isolated eruption. It was a campaign, deliberate, cruel, unrelenting. From the mountaintops of Tur Abdin to the alleyways of Mosul, the goal was always the same: extermination. And yet, in the darkest caverns of history, voices remained. Whispers in Syriac, songs carried by orphans, diaries hidden in walls. A people refused to vanish. As we turn to the next chapter, we follow those voices into the exile, into resistance, and into the hope that even a shattered culture can find its fire again. When the guns fell silent and the smoke of burning villages finally cleared, the earth was littered not only with bodies, but with shattered futures. Amidst the ruins, thousands of children wandered, eyes wide with shock, hearts heavy with loss, their identities fractured like broken glass. They were orphans of a genocide that sought not only to kill their people, but to erase their very existence, their language, their faith, their history. This chapter is their story, a journey through trauma and loss, but also resilience, the relentless fight to hold on to identity when the world tried to strip it away. The numbers are staggering. Tens of thousands of Assyrian children found themselves alone. No parents, no siblings, no village to return to. Some were ripped from their mothers' arms during forced marches through frozen mountains and sun-scorched deserts. Others lost their families in surprise raids. Entire households wiped out overnight. In refugee camps across Persia, Syria, and Iraq, the cries of these children mingled with the wind. Many were so young they could barely remember their own names or the songs their parents once sang to them. One 10-year-old boy later recalled, "I remember only the cold and the silence where my mother's voice used to be." These children became the unwitting carriers of a heritage others desperately sought to extinguish. Western missionaries, horrified by the unfolding atrocities, rushed to establish orphanages, sanctuaries of survival amid chaos. But salvation came at a cost. Inside the walls of these institutions, cultural repression often replaced physical danger. Children were forbidden from speaking Syriac, their ancient language. Instead, they were taught Turkish, Arabic, or European tongues, the languages of their oppressors and rescuers alike. Their names were changed. Assyrian names like Marshamun, Shamiram, or Sargon replaced with Christianized or secular Western names. The hymns of their ancestors, filled with centuries of prayer and memory, were replaced by foreign songs and catechism. A young orphan named Anna wrote in a hidden diary, I dreamed of my mother's voice in Syriac, but when I spoke it aloud, they told me it was wrong. For many children, the orphanage became a place of exile, not just from home, but from self. Western missionaries, horrified by the unfolding atrocities, rushed to establish orphanages, sanctuaries of survival amid chaos. But salvation came at a cost. Inside the walls of these institutions, cultural repression often replaced physical danger. Children were forbidden from speaking Syriac, their ancient language. Instead, they were taught Turkish, Arabic, or European tongues, the languages of their oppressors and rescuers alike. Their names were changed. Assyrian names like Marshimun, Shamiram, or Sargon, replaced with Christianized or secular Western names. The hymns of their ancestors, filled with centuries of prayer and memory, were replaced by foreign songs and catechism. A young orphan named Anna wrote in a hidden diary, "I dreamed of my mother's voice in Syriac, but when I spoke it aloud, they told me it was wrong." For many children, the orphanage became a place of exile, not just from home, but from self. For the orphans, trauma was an invisible wound that shaped every step forward. Many carried nightmares of blood-soaked nights, the screams of family members, and the loneliness of abandoned streets. Generations later, Assyrian families would tell of ancestors who woke screaming, who feared the knock at the door, who refused to speak of the past for fear it might return. Survivors often struggled with identity itself, caught between worlds, never fully belonging to any. Yet despite this, communities formed. In secret gatherings, elders passed down prayers in whispered Syriac. Mothers taught children songs and stories that could not be written down for fear of persecution. The flame of Assyrian culture burned, faint but unextinguished. As letters and reports poured out from missionaries and diplomats, the international community turned away. The horrors faced by Assyrian orphans were drowned out by the clamor of post-war politics. No reparations were made, no mandates granted, no safe havens established. The League of Nations, created to prevent such atrocities, failed the Assyrians utterly. This global silence deepened the wounds. A betrayal added to bereavement. An Assyrian activist later lamented, "We were the children of the world's indifference." Many orphaned Assyrians found themselves scattered from the Middle East to Europe, North America, and Australia. They arrived in foreign cities, strangers in strange lands, carrying memories too heavy to share openly. Diaspora communities struggled to preserve language, faith, and tradition amidst assimilation pressures. In Chicago's Assyrian neighborhoods, in Sydney's suburbs, in Stockholm's cold streets, the descendants of genocide survivors built new lives, while holding tightly to the stories of survival and loss. Their struggle became a fight not only to live, but to remember. The orphans of the Assyrian Genocide carry the weight of a lost world on their shoulders. But in their resilience lies the true victory, the refusal to let memory die, the defiance of erasure. They teach us that survival is more than living. It is remembering, reclaiming, and telling the stories no one else would. This chapter is not an end. It is a promise that the past will not be forgotten, and the Assyrian spirit will endure. The embers of destruction still smoldered across the ancient lands of the Assyrians, But the spirit of a people, though battered and broken, refuses to die. In the darkest chapters of their history, the Assyrians rose not only to resist, but to rebuild, to reclaim what the fires tried to consume. This chapter is a journey into that fierce determination. The fighters who bore arms for survival, the spiritual leaders who nurtured hope, the communities that refused to vanish, and the long, painful road toward remembrance and justice. The genocide was met with defiant resistance across Assyrian homelands. In the towering ranges of Hakkari and the sacred mountains of Turabdin, men and women banded together to defend their villages. These were no armies in the conventional sense, often ill-armed, poorly supplied, and vastly outnumbered. But they possessed a fierce love for their land and faith. Among the most legendary figures was Aga Petros, a former Ottoman officer turned Assyrian military commander. Petros was not just a soldier, he was a strategist, diplomat, and symbol of hope. His forces conducted guerrilla raids, ambushing Ottoman units, buying time for fleeing civilians, and disrupting enemy supply lines. In 1916, at the Battle of Solduz, his forces defeated a Turkish contingent, despite being heavily outnumbered, a rare but crucial victory that inspired further resistance. Another leader, Mar Shamun, 21 Ashai, the patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East, took up both spiritual and political leadership, traveling across embattled regions to rally his people, coordinate relief, and negotiate with foreign powers. Women played vital roles too. They organized supply lines, nursed the wounded, and in some instances, took up arms themselves to protect their homes. These acts of resistance, though ultimately unable to prevent the genocide, slowed the advance of Ottoman forces and saved countless lives. For the Assyrians, Christianity was not just a religion, it was the foundation of identity, culture, and resilience. The church became a sanctuary amid chaos, a beacon guiding a shattered people through nightmarish uncertainty. Patriarchs, bishops, and priests were more than spiritual shepherds. They were community leaders, diplomats, and chroniclers of suffering. Mar Shamun, 21st Ishai, who assumed the patriarchate in 1918, became the international voice for the Assyrians, traveling to Europe and America to plead for assistance and recognition. He famously testified before the League of Nations, describing atrocities and demanding a homeland for his people. Religious institutions also played a direct role on the ground, setting up refugee camps, organizing food and medical aid, and maintaining secret schools where Syriac language and history could be taught. In the monasteries of Turabdin, monks safeguarded precious manuscripts, hiding them from destruction. Their spiritual leadership was a lifeline, helping the Assyrians maintain hope amid despair. Navigating a geopolitical landscape racked by war and imperial ambition was a treacherous task. During World War I, many Assyrians aligned with the Russian Empire, seeing it as a protector of Christian minorities in the region. They formed armed units that fought alongside Russian troops against the Ottomans, hoping this alliance would secure autonomy after the war. Similarly, the British formed the Assyrian levies, military units composed of Assyrian soldiers who aided the Allies. Yet, these alliances were fragile and fraught with risk. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Russian support evaporated abruptly, leaving Assyrians exposed to Ottoman reprisals. Post-war, The political promises that these alliances seemed to guarantee were largely broken. The Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, included provisions for an Assyrian autonomous region, but the treaty was never implemented. Instead, the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923, redrew borders without Assyrian input, effectively erasing their claims and leaving them stateless. Worse still, neighboring governments often viewed Assyrians with suspicion or hostility, seeing them as pawns of colonial powers. This betrayal compounded their vulnerability. When the guns fell silent, survivors faced staggering challenges. Entire villages had been razed, farmland scorched, and infrastructure obliterated. Refugee camps mushroomed in inhospitable terrain, deserts, mountains, and refugee settlements with little access to clean water or medical care. Humanitarian aid, primarily from Western churches and missionary organizations, was critical but insufficient. Rebuilding meant more than brick and mortar. It meant healing social bonds and cultural institutions. Churches that had stood for centuries were reconstructed with rudimentary materials, often by the survivors' own hands. Schools reopened cautiously, teaching the Syriac language and history despite political pressures to assimilate. Women, having lost husbands and sons, became heads of households, steeling themselves to rebuild families and communities. The Assyrian diaspora also began forming new enclaves abroad, maintaining traditions through cultural clubs, language schools, and religious ceremonies. Language is the vessel of a people's soul, and for Assyrians, Syriac, a modern dialect of Aramaic, carried millennia of history. But assimilation pressures were relentless. Governments in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran suppressed minority languages, including Syriac, outlawing its public use in schools and media. Despite this, clandestine efforts flourished. Parents taught children at home. Priests incorporated Syriac hymns and prayers in secret gatherings. In diaspora communities, organizations like the Assyrian Universal Alliance worked to publish books, newspapers, and broadcast radio programs in Syriac. Folklore, songs, and dance became acts of cultural resistance, keeping alive a link to ancestors lost to violence. This fight for cultural survival was in many ways as crucial as the physical fight for survival during the genocide. For decades, the Assyrians struggled to bring the genocide to global awareness. Political sensitivities and regional alliances often kept their plight marginalized. While the Armenian genocide gained international recognition, the Assyrian genocide remained overshadowed. Activists and scholars documented survivor testimonies, gathered archival evidence, and campaigned for recognition. Memorials were erected in diaspora capitals, Chicago, Sydney, Detroit, places where Assyrian communities flourished. The Assyrian Martyrs Monument in Chicago stands as a powerful reminder of resilience and remembrance. Yet official recognition remains limited in many countries, often complicated by contemporary geopolitics. This ongoing struggle is part of the living legacy of the genocide, a fight for memory against erasure. The true heart of this chapter lies in the stories of individuals and families. Men like Naum Mokarzel, who became a publisher and advocate in America, used media to promote Assyrian identity and awareness. Women who survived forced assimilation preserved family histories in secret diaries and oral traditions. Children who grew up in diaspora rebuilt communities from nothing, opening churches, schools, and cultural centers. The Assyrian Genocide did not extinguish a people. It scattered them across the globe. Yet they carried their history and hope in their hearts. The journey from genocide to survival is one of pain and perseverance, loss and hope. Assyrians continue to rebuild, remember, and resist oblivion. Their history is a testament to the power of identity, community, and faith. This chapter is a tribute to those who fought, who healed, and who refused to be forgotten. The genocide scattered the Assyrian people across continents, turning centuries-old homelands into memories and distant dreams. From the mountain villages of Tur Abdin to the bustling cities of Chicago, Sydney, and Stockholm, the Assyrian diaspora grew, carrying with it a rich but fragile heritage. This chapter explores the profound challenges and triumphs of identity, community, and survival in a world that often seemed indifferent or hostile. It is the story of adaptation without surrender, of culture preserved across oceans, and of a people's enduring quest to be seen and heard. In the aftermath of World War I and the genocide, Assyrian survivors fled their ancestral lands. Many sought refuge in neighboring countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, often settling in refugee camps or marginal lands. Others journeyed farther, to Europe, North America, Australia, and beyond. These migrations were fraught with hardship, treacherous travel, economic insecurity, and discrimination. In the 1920s and 1930s, large waves of Assyrian refugees arrived in the United States, particularly settling in Chicago, which would become a cultural hub. Australia welcomed Assyrians in the mid-20th century, with communities forming in Sydney and Melbourne. In Sweden and Germany, Assyrians rebuilt lives amid new social and political landscapes. For the dispersed Assyrians, rebuilding community was paramount. Churches became anchors of identity, not merely places of worship, but centers for cultural preservation, social support, and political activism. In cities like Chicago, the establishment of the Mar Shimun Church served as a vital gathering place. Assyrian schools, often run by churches or cultural associations, taught the Syriac language, history, and traditions to younger generations born far from their homeland. Organizations like the Assyrian Universal Alliance and Assyrian National Federation emerged, coordinating advocacy efforts and fostering cultural pride. Festivals celebrating Assyrian New Year Akitu and other traditions reinforced communal bonds. The diaspora experience brought difficult questions of identity. Children born in foreign lands faced the pull of assimilation, the desire to fit into dominant cultures versus the pull of ancestral roots. Language loss became a critical issue. Many second and third generation Assyrians grew up speaking primarily the language of their new countries. Some families resisted, passing down Syriac as a sacred link to the past. Others struggled with the pressure to abandon it. Intermarriage, educational opportunities, and social integration added complexity to identity formation. Yet for many, embracing a hybrid identity became a way to survive and thrive. The Assyrian diaspora became increasingly vocal on the global stage. Activists and leaders campaigned tirelessly for genocide recognition, minority rights, and political representation in their countries of origin and residence. They lobbied governments, organized demonstrations, and partnered with human rights organizations. A key focus was raising awareness about the continued persecution of Assyrians in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The tragic destruction of Assyrian villages and cultural sites during conflicts such as the Iraq War and the rise of ISIS renewed international attention. The diaspora also sparked a cultural renaissance. Artists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers began producing works reflecting Assyrian history, identity, and contemporary struggles. Literature in Syriac and translation into other languages flourished, preserving oral histories and retelling the genocide stories. Music blended traditional Assyrian melodies with modern genres, reaching wider audiences. In recent decades, digital platforms have enabled Assyrians worldwide to connect, share, and promote their heritage. Amid these broad trends lie countless personal narratives of courage and resilience. Stories of families rebuilding after displacement, of individuals reclaiming lost languages, of communities coming together in foreign lands to celebrate New Year's festivals and weddings. For example, in Chicago, an Assyrian youth center established in the 1980s provided safe spaces to explore identity and history. In Sweden, young Assyrians have become political leaders, educators, and cultural ambassadors. These stories remind us that survival is not only about endurance, but about flourishing against the odds. The Assyrian identity remains contested and fragile. Ongoing persecution in the Middle East, political instability, and pressures of assimilation threaten to dilute their heritage. But at the same time, renewed activism, scholarship, and community organizing have brought new hope. International recognition of the genocide is slowly increasing, and cultural pride among youth is surging. The diaspora today is a vibrant, global network committed to preserving the past while building the future. The journey of the Assyrian diaspora is a testament to the resilience of a people who refuse to be forgotten. From the ruins of genocide to the challenges of displacement and assimilation, they have forged communities of hope and remembrance. Their story is one of survival, identity, and the unbreakable bond between past and present. As we look ahead, the Assyrian people continue to write new chapters of renewal, recognition, and enduring spirit. The shadow of genocide stretches far beyond the past. For the Assyrian people, the wounds inflicted a century ago remain raw, echoing in the present day. The fight for recognition is not only about history, it is a struggle for justice, dignity, and survival in a world that too often overlooks them. This chapter explores the complex contemporary challenges facing Assyrians, from ongoing persecution in the Middle East, through political struggles in their countries of origin, to the global diaspora's relentless advocacy for acknowledgement and rights. It is a story of resilience and resistance, unfolding in the harshest of circumstances. Despite the passage of time, Assyrians remain one of the most vulnerable minorities in the Middle East. The fall of the Ottoman Empire did not bring lasting peace or security. In the 20th and 21st centuries, waves of violence, political upheaval, and sectarian conflict have repeatedly forced Assyrians to flee their ancestral lands. During the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, policies of Arabization marginalized Assyrians, confiscating lands and suppressing cultural expression. The 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq unleashed sectarian violence that devastated Assyrian communities. The rise of the Islamic State, ISIS, in 2014 marked another catastrophic chapter. Assyrian towns like Karakosh, Bakdida, the largest historically Assyrian city in Iraq, were captured, leading to mass displacement, destruction of churches, and cultural artifacts. Families were forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Survivors recount harrowing tales of escape, loss, and the struggle to rebuild amid ongoing insecurity. In Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, Assyrians face significant obstacles in securing political representation and autonomy. Though recognized as a minority, Assyrians often lack meaningful participation in government or protections under the law. Attempts to establish autonomous regions, such as the proposed Nineveh Plains administration in Iraq, have been met with political resistance and instability. In Syria, the ongoing civil war has further fractured Assyrian communities. Some have formed militias like the Sutoro and Narain Democratic Party's military wing to protect their neighborhoods, but the broader political landscape remains uncertain. In Turkey, Assyrians continue to face challenges with property rights, religious freedom, and cultural expression. The global Assyrian diaspora plays a critical role in advocating for the rights of their communities back home and for genocide recognition. Organizations such as the Assyrian Universal Alliance, AUA, Assyrian National Council, and various human rights groups have coordinated lobbying efforts in the United States, Europe, and the United Nations. Campaigns to raise awareness about ongoing persecution, cultural destruction, and the need for reparations have gained traction, though official recognition remains patchy. In 2019, the United States formally recognized the Assyrian Genocide alongside the Armenian and Greek genocides, a landmark victory after decades of activism. However, many countries and international bodies still refrain from formal acknowledgement, often due to geopolitical considerations. Technology has become a powerful tool for preserving and promoting Assyrian identity worldwide. Digital media platforms allow Assyrians to share language lessons, cultural events, and historical archives across continents. YouTube channels, podcasts, and social media accounts run by young Assyrians celebrate their heritage and tackle contemporary issues. Online Syriac language courses help combat language loss. Virtual communities provide support networks for those grappling with identity and assimilation pressures. Cultural festivals, once confined to local communities, now reach global audiences via live streams and digital outreach. Behind the statistics and political analysis lie deeply personal stories that bring history to life. Survivors of the ISIS occupation of towns like Karakosh recount stories of courage, resilience, and faith. Young activists in diaspora communities speak about the challenges of maintaining identity while navigating multicultural societies. Elders share oral histories of genocide and exile, while youth document their experiences through art, music, and writing. One refugee, Miriam, described her journey. "We left everything behind, but our faith and our stories traveled with us. They keep us strong." These voices remind us that the Assyrian story is not only one of tragedy, but of enduring human spirit. The road ahead is fraught with challenges. Continued instability in the Middle East threatens the survival of Assyrians in their historic homelands. Assimilation and cultural erosion remain persistent risks in diaspora communities. Yet, opportunities for renewal also emerge. Growing global awareness of minority rights, advances in digital communication, and the tireless efforts of activists provide hope. New generations are reclaiming their heritage with pride and vigor. Collaborations between Assyrians and other indigenous and minority groups worldwide offer solidarity and shared advocacy. The fight for recognition, justice, and survival continues, a testament to the resilience of a people who refuse to be forgotten. Through memory and action, the Assyrian voice grows louder. Their history, culture, and future are intertwined in a powerful narrative of endurance. This chapter is a call to witness, to remember, and to stand alongside those who carry the legacy of the past into the promise of tomorrow. Centuries of history, faith, language, and tradition flow through the veins of the Assyrian people. Though scarred by genocide, exile, and struggle, their culture remains a living, breathing testament to endurance and hope. This chapter is a profound exploration of the cultural legacy passed down through generations and the complex, dynamic future the Assyrians strive to build amid shifting realities. It is a story of art, language, religion, and memory, and of a people forging identity anew in a rapidly changing world. Assyrian culture stretches back over 3,000 years, one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. At its heart is the Syriac language, a direct descendant of ancient Aramaic, the very language spoken by Jesus Christ. Syriac is more than a means of communication. It is a vessel of history, theology, poetry, and communal memory. Liturgical traditions of the Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, and the Syriac Orthodox Church carry the spiritual heritage forward. Traditional music, dance, and oral storytelling preserve the vibrant textures of Assyrian life, stories of heroes, of ancient kings and queens, of harvest festivals, and the rhythms of daily toil. Artisans continue to craft intricate carvings, textiles, and jewelry that echo motifs handed down through millennia. Even in diaspora, these cultural markers anchor identity and provide continuity across generations. The genocide wrought catastrophic damage to this rich heritage. Whole communities of artisans, priests, and storytellers were lost. Ancient churches were destroyed, libraries burned, and manuscripts lost. The trauma severed cultural transmission, threatening extinction of language and traditions. But Assyrians' tenacity meant survival was never merely physical. Refugees smuggled sacred texts across borders. Families passed down hymns and prayers in whispered voices, even in exile. Diaspora communities established cultural centers and schools to preserve what remained. Scholars documented oral histories before they faded. Language remains a cornerstone of Assyrian identity, yet it is endangered. Efforts to revive and maintain Syriac face numerous challenges: political repression in home countries, the dominance of Arabic, Kurdish, Turkish, and Persian, and assimilation pressures in diaspora. Still, activists and educators have launched innovative programs. In the 21st century, Syriac language apps, online courses, and media broadcasts have made the language accessible worldwide. Annual conferences and workshops bring together linguists, teachers, and community leaders. Young Assyrians increasingly embrace their mother tongue as a symbol of pride and resistance. The past few decades have seen a remarkable cultural revival. Assyrian artists, poets, novelists, and filmmakers have taken up the task of narrating their people's story anew. Literature reflects the themes of memory, loss, exile, and hope. Contemporary novels grapple with the trauma of genocide and the complexities of identity in the diaspora. Music blends traditional instruments like the zurna and dohol with modern genres, creating vibrant new sounds. Films and documentaries chronicle historic events and modern struggles, reaching global audiences. Exhibitions of Assyrian art showcase the enduring creativity of a people shaped by history, but unbound by it. Religious institutions remain pillars of Assyrian identity, providing community, education, and spiritual solace. Despite political challenges and displacement, churches in the Middle East and diaspora continue their vital role. Religious festivals such as Easter, Christmas, and the unique Assyrian Kalo di Sol, Bride of the Light, ceremonies serve as moments of communal reaffirmation. Clergy work tirelessly to engage youth and incorporate cultural education into religious practice. Interfaith dialogue initiatives help Assyrians build bridges with other communities while asserting their distinct identity. The Assyrian future stands at a crossroads. The pressures of globalization and migration risk further assimilation and cultural dilution. Political instability in the Middle East continues to threaten communities in historic homelands. Yet, hope abounds. Younger generations, empowered by technology and global networks, assert their heritage with pride. Educational institutions offer Syriac studies and Assyrian history programs. Diaspora activism grows in political influence, championing minority rights and cultural preservation. Cross-cultural collaborations expand understanding and solidarity. The Assyrian narrative is no longer one of passive victimhood, but active self-definition and renewal. Throughout history and today, individuals stand as guardians of Assyrian culture. Elders recount ancient tales to children, ensuring continuity. Artists and writers channel collective memory into new creations. Teachers and religious leaders serve as cultural transmitters, mentors, and advocates. Community activists navigate political systems to secure recognition and rights. For example, Dr. Emmanuel Camber, a linguist and advocate, has dedicated his life to preserving the Syriac language and promoting Assyrian cultural awareness worldwide. These stories illuminate the human spirit behind the grand narrative. Memorials and commemorations serve as powerful spaces for remembering the genocide and asserting identity. Annual remembrance events, often held on August 7th, the Assyrian Martyrs' Day, unite communities globally. Monuments like the Assyrian Martyrs Monument in Chicago and memorial plaques in northern Iraq stand as testaments to loss and resilience. However, the politics of memory remain contested. Recognition of the genocide is uneven, complicated by regional geopolitics and international reluctance. Assyrians continue to campaign for acknowledgement as a step toward justice and healing. Education remains the most powerful tool for cultural survival and empowerment. Assyrian schools and cultural centers teach history, language, and arts, instilling pride in youth. Global networks facilitate collaboration between diaspora communities and those in the homeland. Advocacy efforts engage governments and international organizations to secure rights and recognition. Intercommunity dialogue strengthens bonds within Assyrians and with other minorities facing similar struggles. This multifaceted approach builds a foundation for a vibrant and resilient Assyrian future. The Assyrian cultural legacy is a river flowing through millennia, at times dammed, diverted, but never extinguished. Its waters nourish the present and promise a future where the Assyrian people reclaim their place in history and the world. Through language, faith, art, and memory, they keep the flame alive, a beacon for generations yet to come. The story continues, ever evolving, ever enduring. The scars of genocide run deep, not only across landscapes, but through the souls of survivors and their descendants. Healing from such devastation is neither simple nor swift. It demands courage to confront trauma, strength to rebuild shattered communities, and a relentless pursuit of justice. This chapter explores the ongoing journey of the Assyrian people, their efforts to heal wounds both visible and invisible, to seek recognition and redress, and to carve a path toward a future shaped by dignity, resilience, and hope. Genocide inflicts profound psychological wounds that transcend generations. Survivors grappled with grief, loss, and the trauma of witnessing unimaginable horrors. These psychological scars manifested in various ways. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression became common among survivors. Families struggled with the loss of loved ones and the destruction of their way of life. The disruption of social networks and traditional community structures led to isolation and despair. The transmission of trauma to children and grandchildren, known as intergenerational trauma, created further challenges for identity and mental health. Yet amidst this pain, stories of resilience emerged. Communities supporting one another, rituals of mourning and remembrance, and the power of faith and culture to heal. Cultural practices and spiritual traditions played a vital role in healing. Religious ceremonies provided spaces to honor the dead and seek solace. Annual memorials, prayers, and festivals became acts of collective healing, reaffirming community bonds. Music, dance, and storytelling helped survivors and descendants process trauma and reclaim identity. Organizations formed to support mental health within Assyrian communities, blending modern psychology with traditional practices. The revitalization of language and arts further nurtured a sense of pride and continuity essential for healing. Justice for the Assyrian genocide has been elusive, but remains a central demand. Unlike some other genocides of the 20th century, formal trials and reparations for Assyrians have been limited. Advocates have pursued multiple avenues, international recognition of the genocide to acknowledge historical truth, calls for reparations and restitution of property and rights, legal frameworks to protect Assyrian minorities in contemporary states, documentation and preservation of evidence to prevent denial. Organizations such as the Assyrian Universal Alliance and various human rights groups have worked tirelessly to advance these causes. Recognition by countries like the United States and the European Parliament represents important milestones, though much work remains. Recognition of the Assyrian genocide faces political obstacles. Regional geopolitics often complicate acknowledgement, as countries with ties to Turkey and its allies resist labeling events as genocide. The conflation of Assyrian suffering with broader Armenian or Greek narratives sometimes obscures their distinct experiences. Some governments fear that recognition could destabilize fragile regional balances or complicate diplomatic relations. Despite these barriers, continued advocacy and education gradually chip away at denial and indifference. Grassroots movements, academic scholarship, and survivor testimonies form a growing chorus demanding justice. For many Assyrians, healing includes reclaiming their historic homelands. The Nineveh plains of Iraq, home to many Assyrians before ISIS's destruction, remain central to hopes for return and autonomy. Efforts to establish political and security frameworks that guarantee Assyrian rights and safety have faced resistance from regional powers and internal divisions. Despite the challenges, local leaders, international NGOs, and diaspora groups collaborate on reconstruction projects, rebuilding homes, churches, schools, and infrastructure. These efforts symbolize more than physical rebuilding. They are acts of cultural survival and defiance against erasure. The global Assyrian diaspora plays an indispensable role in healing and justice. Diaspora communities provide financial support, political advocacy, and cultural preservation. They fund reconstruction projects in homeland areas and offer humanitarian aid to displaced families. Diaspora activism also amplifies Assyrian voices on the world stage, advocating for genocide recognition and minority rights. Importantly, diaspora youth engage with their heritage through education, art, and community organizing, ensuring continuity across generations. Education serves as a powerful tool for healing and justice. Assyrian studies programs at universities around the world explore history, language, culture, and genocide studies. Scholars work to document survivor testimonies, preserve manuscripts, and analyze historical evidence. Educational outreach in schools and communities combats ignorance and denial. Public awareness campaigns foster empathy and solidarity. By illuminating the past, education lays the foundation for a more just future. The human dimension of healing is found in individual journeys. Survivors and descendants who transform trauma into strength. Take Anna, a descendant of genocide survivors who channels her family's history into poetry that speaks of loss and renewal. Or Joseph, a community organizer in Australia who leads cultural festivals that unite dispersed Assyrians in celebration and remembrance. Their stories embody the resilience of a people who honor their past while embracing the future. Assyrians increasingly build alliances with other marginalized peoples worldwide. Shared experiences of genocide, displacement, and cultural survival foster solidarity. Collaborations with Armenian, Kurdish, Yazidi, and Native American communities promote joint advocacy and cultural exchange. These partnerships strengthen political influence and enrich cultural understanding. Together, they challenge systems of oppression and strive for a world that respects diversity and human rights. The future of the Assyrian people is shaped by the twin pillars of remembrance and renewal. Memorializing the genocide safeguards truth and honors victims. Renewing culture, language, and community builds strength for generations to come. Political advocacy seeks justice and safeguards rights. Healing addresses the wounds that run deep in individual and collective psyches. The Assyrian story is far from over. It is a living, evolving narrative of survival, dignity, and hope. Healing from genocide is a journey without end. For the Assyrians, it is a journey carried forward by memory, faith, and unyielding spirit. Justice is not a distant ideal, but a present necessity. The path forward demands courage, unity, and unwavering commitment to truth. As Assyrians continue to rebuild their communities, preserve their culture, and seek recognition, they illuminate a universal truth. Even in the face of the darkest horrors, humanity's light endures. Have a good one, everyone. Thank you for tuning in once again for an unbelievable notch in our history. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share, as that is the only thing I ask in order to keep these spine-shivering points in humanity coming your way.